Welcome back, you guys. Today we're going to be mixing our tones in our primary and secondary sections. Your tones are muted down hues, so you'll notice that it's not as intense as the hue itself. You create a tone by mixing the hue with its complementary color, so the color that is opposite it on the color wheel. When you mix your tone, you're only adding in a touch of its complementary color to tone it down and to reduce that hue's intensity. We're going to be painting our tones as a gradient on wet. So our hues was a gradient on dry paper. For our tones, we'll be wetting the paper and then doing the gradient technique inside that wet section. I would like all of you to begin by mixing your green with the light yellow and the cyan blue. We're going to be adding a touch of this green into our red to create our red tones for the red triangle section. Make sure you're wetting the red and lifting a lot of it up into the red palette. Add a little bit of green at a time to make sure that you're not going to change the red too much. We just want a slightly less intense version of the regular red hue. To begin painting, you're going to be doing a gradient wash on wet. So with a clean brush, lay down a nice wet section where your tone should go. You don't want a pool of water, just a light dampened area of water on the paper. After you have everything nice and wet, you can dip your toned out red in and start painting it in. Notice with a gradient on wet, you're not re-dipping your brush back into the pigment. You're just putting it down first, and then you're swiping the brush from the left to the right, all the way down, slowly fading out the pigment as it's getting spread and mixed with the water. Now I noticed after I placed this first down that it didn't quite look like a tone. It looked too similar to my hue. So I went back, I added a little bit more green to my red, and then I'm repainting this section in the same technique I previously did. My paper was already wet, so I didn't have to apply more water. I just went back in with one stroke of a more toned out red and then pulled that pigment down to get the gradient. You'll have to put a new wet wash into your other tonal sections within your red triangle. Make sure once again that the water does not pool up and that you're placing water everywhere where you want the pigment to go. If you get water in a section that you don't want your tone to go, then you're going to want to wait for the water to dry and then repaint the water back in, because wherever you have water, that's where your paint is going to flow into. So just be very careful to not paint into other sections. And here's a better depiction of how to paint in tones now that we actually have a better toned color here that we're putting onto the color wheel. I am dipping in the pigment on the top portion of my section there, making it really, really nice and thick. And I'm doing this to every section of my tonal area. Then after I have that nice solid tone, I'm going to drag that pigment down. And as I'm dragging it down, that pigment is getting spread out, and that's how I'm creating that gradient. Just make sure that when you're dragging down, you're going with your brush from a right to a left movement and then a left to the right. And that's how you'll get that nice transition from dark to light in that tone section. Next, begin preparing your green tone. Recreate your green by using yellow and cyan blue. And then when you add red into the green, you need to add a little bit at a time. You'll notice I put way too much in, and it kind of created this really ugly brown color. So I had to restart. So whenever you're adding in that color's complementary color, so the color that's opposite on the color wheel, then you need to only add in just a little bit. And when you add in that little bit, you have more control, and look how much better that green looks. It looks so much prettier. After mixing your green tone, apply it as a gradient on wet in your green color section. So let's begin painting in our purple tones. To make purple, use crimson red and ultramarine blue in equal parts. Then, to make it into a tone, add a little bit of yellow at a time, having lots of control so it doesn't get too brown. Then paint your tones in as a gradient on wet in your purple section. To create your yellow tones, remix your purple with equal proportions of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. After you have the perfect purple, clean off your brush, add the yellow back onto the palette lid, and then from that purple section, lift up the purple a little bit at a time and add it into the yellow. You don't want to add too much because you want to have control over, what that yellow looks like. You don't want to make it too brown. You're just adding in enough purple to create a nice tonal yellow. Same as before, paint in your yellow tone as a gradient on wet. Next, let's mix our orange tone. Remember, to create an orange, you need 2/3 light yellow, 1/3 crimson red. To create a tone of orange, you're just adding touches of ultramarine blue to decrease the intensity of the orange. And then paint your orange tone into the tonal sections of the orange triangle as a gradient transition on wet paper. To create your blue tone, mix orange again using light yellow and crimson red. Pick up the ultramarine blue and create a nice solid, thick watercolor blue puddle on the palette lid. And then with a clean brush, lift up the orange and slowly add it to the blue until you create a nice toned blue for your watercolor painting. And then paint your blue tone as a gradient on wet in your blue triangular section.